Okay, I hope I hope you were able to achieve your. It's Tuesday. It's still before noon. It's like you have an hour and a half to get your paper in still before it's due. I hope you had. I hope it wasn't too annoying. The subject, the topic. It's been difficult. Rumor has it we're coming to school next week, so that's great. I'm looking forward to it. I don't like being in empty classrooms. When we come back, we're going to have a short quiz that is used to verify your work. So it'll be basic, simple, like one period, not more. So expect that in the first week that we're back. Okay, so today I'm going to introduce a little bit about trade, free trade, trade in general. This is still under pest. You can see here from our environmental factors. We're going to do this within, this is week 5, so we're kind of starting it now. We'll have to finish it next week. And then we'll be able to have some kind of test on it by the end of next week. So a little quiz and then a test within 2 weeks. It's going to have to go fast. And then we're going to get into marketing. So international marketing, which is fun. It's more fun. Anyway, trade. Let's talk about trade on chapter 3. Chapter 3 in our book. Chapter 3, page 21. A little background. Obviously, we're at an incredibly high level of trade now, international trade. It's not even about just countries exchanging one good for another. There are global supply chains that come together to help us make the things that we use in our everyday lives, whether it's computers or smartphones or whatever. And these go through long supply chains. There are sometimes a dozen countries involved in the production of one product. So it's more than just trade now. It's even difficult for us to identify the country of origin of the products that we use in many cases. Sometimes it's very clear, but many times we don't know. We don't know everything that went into it. Even if agricultural products are being produced and they're using fertilizer from companies that are overseas, that's still contributing to trade. So supplies, when you see all the construction around the city, the subway, for example, a lot of the equipment is imported from other countries, not manufactured in Vietnam. So the airplanes that we use to fly are all usually made by Boeing or Airbus, international companies. So it would almost be impossible for one country to be self-sufficient at this point. The world is pretty integrated. We can go back though, we can imagine a little simpler world where people didn't really mix as much and didn't travel as much. And at that time, I mean, Vietnam is much older than my country, and many of the towns, if you go there, they're known for something in particular, some kind of product that they make, or that they grow, or fish sauce, or jam, coconuts, or coffee, and probably 1,000 other goods. So traditionally in Vietnam, there's a lot of trade between the different villages and towns that have found benefits from specializing over the centuries or even thousands of years. That's the basis of why we're good at this buying and selling game here, I think. We're used to being able to exchange, we're used to being able to manage and consider exchange. So that's the early trade. The early trade would be maybe Vietnam was ahead of its time, you know, to specialize, to have different areas specialize so much. And then as countries started to come together more, it wasn't just about your neighbors. I guess you could call it the colonial period. The countries that had colonies, whether it was in Europe, the relationship between Europe and you know, Singapore and Cambodia and Vietnam and Africa and India and England. So England and India is a very powerful example. At this point, the trade was based on, you know, exploitation, powerful European countries being able to, in some cases, paying for it, but in many cases, taking different spices, resources from the countries that they were, the colonies that they had. But that also spread, you know, the taste that people had for different goods. You know, I think that some people in England now would say that the national snack food is Indian curry. So over the years, the cultural bonds of countries and even colonies have brought them closer together culturally and interdependent on trade with one another. So trade is developed over time until about, well, I don't know if you want to call it trade, but exploitation and exchange have developed over time. A real theory of trade and justification for trade occurred in England in the 1800s. I believe it was David Ricardo was the economist, and he figured out, you know, at that time there was a real big scientific, it's in the middle of the Enlightenment, and there's a big push for justification of why things are good. You have to explain, why should we trade? What's the point of trade? What makes it good? So theories of trade were developed at this time, and it was justified. Some of the elements of specialization are involved there. Like I said about Vietnam, you had these different villages that specialized in different kinds of production of different goods to trade. So here we are, we're in week 5, 6, and we're going to get into this in a minute, but I think that I want to jump in and just do the crash course, and then I'll explain it and highlight some elements of it that is supposed to explain why trade is beneficial for countries. What is the like? Why should we trade? What's the benefit of that? Justifying it, the theory. So here's a pretty good video. I like this video. It has a little bit of math, but not too much. One term you should know before we start is called opportunity cost. You may know it from last year, but opportunity cost means the second choice or the other choice or alternative to what you choose to do. So if you choose to buy a new car and you spend $200 million on that car, the opportunity cost is what else you could have done with that $200 million. Could you have invested it and made money off of it? Could you have, you know, bought 10 motorbikes or whatever? So your choices are, you know, your opportunity cost means the things that you could do with your resources that you don't choose, the other choices that you don't take advantage of with your resources. opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of having one girlfriend is that you can't have all the other girlfriends. The opportunity cost of, you know, I don't know. You know, the opportunity cost is limited by your budget, basically. Okay, here we go.
Hi, I'm Adrian Hill.
And I'm Mr. Clifford, and welcome to Crash Course Economics.
Here at Crash Course, we recognize that difficult subjects are sometimes taught with truly unintelligible vocabulary that's difficult for us regular people to understand.
But it doesn't have to be that complicated. Remember, economics is the study of scarcity and choices. We have limited resources, so we need a way to analyze the best way to use them. We need economics to make wise decisions in the future. It also helps us understand the past.
Most empires, wars, and human endeavors can be explained using economics. All you have to understand is who wanted what. The American Civil War wasn't just about freedom. It was fought because southern states wanted to keep using cheap slave labor. It was economics.
Econ can explain so much about the world, and that's what we love teaching it. And that's what makes it the greatest subject of all time.
Take that, physics! We're coming for you. Let's stick with this history theme and talk about the progress of humanity throughout the ages. Using measurements like life expectancy, child mortality, and income per capita, we can show the majority of humans that ever lived had terrible lives. Statistically speaking, it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that people saw a significant and sustained increase in their standard of living. Population skyrocketed, but so did life expectancy and food supplies and hospitals and eventually toilets and refrigerators.
It was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that Adam Smith, the first modern economist, wrote his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, or Annotated Commentary. He wasn't great at naming books, but he was really good at explaining the source of prosperity. Smith concluded that it was specialization, what he called the division of labor, that made countries wealthy. Let's go to the thought bubble.
When I think of specialization, I think of a pizza restaurant where different workers have specific tasks like preparing the ingredients, making the pizza, putting it in the oven, taking it out, and putting it in the box. This division of labor makes each worker more productive since they can each focus on the thing they do best. And they don't waste time switching between jobs. But specialization goes beyond the assembly line for pizza. To produce the cheese, there was a dairy farmer who specialized in raising cows. The oven was designed and manufactured by people who specialize in engineering ovens. The friendly mustache guy in the pizza box, someone had to stand him on there. I love that guy. Adam Smith observed, in every improved society, the farmer is generally nothing but a farmer. The manufacturer, nothing but a manufacturer. The labor necessary to produce any one complete manufacture is almost always divided among a great number of hands.
Okay, so of course that's the early part of it's amazing that it took another, I guess, 80 or 90 years before they got before Henry Ford created the assembly line after Adam Smith. But the idea is that you can imagine it if you needed to produce whatever it is, 10. I mean, I do it when I mark papers, I would rather mark one question for all the students rather than mark each individual paper. You go through each individual paper and you have to mark different questions, think differently about each question, shift your mind for each question. But if I just take question number 1 and I do 20 papers in a row, I can compare all the answers, I can focus on what the students' answers and the differences between the answers that the students give and highlight quality based on that particular answer. So I turn it into a specialization, I turn it into one task at a time instead of trying to do all the different parts of your paper at the same time. The same is true, you can imagine, in many cases, if you had to imagine that you have all the parts for imagine that you have a bunch of Lego cars, they're all the same, and you have to make them as fast as possible. You have 4 people, and you take the boxes of Legos, and each person opens one box and has to make the thing from scratch. So they have to look at all the instructions, they have to keep going until they finish it. Now imagine another situation where it's like, okay, someone's responsible for the body of the car, then they pass it to the person who does the wheels, and then they do the tops, and the last person does like the decals and the the different things that need to be done. If you time it out correctly, you'll probably be able to make more Lego cars faster if everybody does the little piece, you know, their piece that they know how to do well. So that's specialization.
Imagine what it would be like to make a pizza completely on your own, from scratch. You would have to grow the wheat and tomatoes and raise the cow. You would make the flour, the cheese, the oven, the pan, and then draw the mustache guy in the box. Without specialization, if you want something, you have to make it yourself. And for thousands of years of human history, specialization was, well, pretty minimal. Of course, humans specialized prior to the Industrial Revolution. It's one of the marks of civilization that we mentioned in our World History series. But the modern era has taken this to the extreme. Think of how many people from how many different specialized fields it takes to make a smartphone. All of them working in harmony so I can tweet my super profound thoughts. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So specialization makes people more productive, but Adam Smith said that it's trade that makes them better off. Assume that John can produce either pizza or t-shirts. If he's way better at producing pizza, then he should specialize in making pizza and then trade with someone else, like Hank, who's way better at making t-shirts. Everyone knows Hank's better at making t-shirts, right? With trade, each of them can end up with more pizza and shirts than if they tried to make them on their own. To fully explain this idea of the benefits of trade, we need to show you an economic model. But before we go any further, know that economists geek out over models and graphs. Don't get all worked up about the numbers, they're not that complicated. Models are just visuals to help us simplify and explain concepts. It's time for the model, so let's go to the runway.
Now, this is the first graph you'll see in an economics textbook. It's called the Production Possibilities Frontier, or PPF. The PPF shows the different combinations of two goods being produced using all resources efficiently. Now, here's a made-up example.
I don't know what to do to make that YouTube thing go away.
If the United States uses all of its workers and factories to produce airplanes, it can produce. Now, this is the first graph you'll see in an economics textbook. It's called the Production Possibilities Frontier, or PPF. The PPF shows the different combinations of two goods being produced using all resources efficiently. Now, here's a made-up example. If the United States uses all of its workers and factories to produce airplanes, it can produce 500 per day, but it can't produce any shoes. Now, if they use all their resources to produce shoes, they can produce 1,000 tons per day, but they can't produce any planes. Now, because the United States has limited resources, they can't produce any combination beyond the Production Possibilities Frontier. So it's impossible to produce 500 planes and 1,000 tons of shoes.
Wait, Mr. Clifford, I'm gonna stop you here.
He talks fast, but basically he's showing the extremes on both sides, right? If you have X amount of resources, limited resources, you could, in this case, spend all of your resources to make X, or all of your resources to make Y. And then here, this yellow line is the range of mixes that you can make of all of them. That'll change depending on the product. But there's no point, that's what he's saying at the end, there's no point that's green. There's no point where you can make 500 of these and 1,000 of these at the same time. That won't work. So there's got to be choices that need to be made.
Beyond the Production Possibilities Frontier. So it's impossible to produce 500 planes and 1,000 tons of shoes.
Wait, Mr. Clifford, I'm gonna stop you here for a second. We don't live in a world where there are only two things that a country can produce. There are like a million things that U.S. workers can choose to make. Toilet paper, zippers, adorable stuffed kitty cats holding heart, artisanal sauerkraut. We don't live in a world of just shoes and airplanes. So what's the real world value of the Production Possibilities Frontier?
The idea is once you really understand that there's trade-offs between producing two goods, that same logic applies to any number of goods. And adding additional goods makes it more complex, but doesn't really add any more insights. So economists usually stick with just two goods. Now, what if American companies mismanage their resources and try to produce planes and shoe factories and shoes and plane factories? Well, they need a point inside the Production Possibilities Frontier showing an inefficient use of resources. So every possible combination inside the curve is inefficient, and on the curve is efficient, and outside the curve is impossible. Now let's compare this PPF to China's. China can produce 100 planes per day, or 800 tons of shoes. Since the United States can produce more planes than China, they have an absolute advantage in the production of planes. The US also has an absolute advantage in production.
All right, so new term, absolute versus comparative advantage. So the absolute advantage is an advantage that one country can make more of X than the other country. That's an absolute advantage. In this example here, the United States has an absolute advantage in airplanes, 5-to-1 ratio, and they have an absolute advantage in the amount of shoes they can produce, which is at a 5-to-4 ratio. So in both cases, the U.S. has an absolute advantage in production than China does. Now, there may be some cases where that absolute advantage, there is no way to trade, but if there's any imbalance, if there's any difference in the ratios between the absolute advantages, then there's actually a benefit. That's what he's going to explain now. Why? So that's the next thing. So the absolute advantage, it goes to the U.S., but there's something called comparative advantage, and that's what he's going to explain now. Comparative advantage means that, in this case, yes, trade would be good. So check it out. Remember the term opportunity cost.
From shoes. Since the U.S. can produce more of both goods, you might think there's no reason to trade, that they should just produce both on their own. Well, no, remember, specialization in trade makes people, and in this case, countries, better off. Now, stick with me. Let's calculate the opportunity cost of the United States to produce one plane. Every single time they produce an additional plane, it costs them 2 tons of shoes. China, on the other hand, gives up 8 tons of shoes for each plane they produce. And since the U.S. has a lower opportunity cost, they have what's called a comparative advantage. China has a comparative advantage in the production of shoes. But here's the best part. If the U.S. specializes in planes, they can import shoes from China at a lower opportunity cost than if they produce shoes themselves. For example, if these two countries make a deal to trade one plane for 4 tons of shoes, the U.S. would be better off. They would rather get 4 tons of shoes per plane from China than only get 2 tons of shoes per plane by making shoes on their own.
He talks really fast, but the idea here is that if you look at what the value is, the opportunity cost. So for China, making one plane, the opportunity cost for them is 8 pairs of shoes. So every plane they make, they could be making 8 pairs of shoes. And then in the other comparison for the US, so that's because 100 planes equals 800 tons of shoes. So in the US, it's 1,000 to 500. So you can make 500 planes or 1,000 tons of shoes. So for the U.S., the opportunity cost is 2 tons of shoes for each airplane. So instead of making shoes, I'll just make airplanes, and then I can trade with China and maybe get more than 2 shoes, 2 tons of shoes. Maybe I can get China to spend pay me 4 tons of shoes. So then I have more airplanes and more shoes than I would have had before. China's happy because they're going to get what? They're going to get 1 airplane for only 4 pairs of shoes, 4 tons of shoes, whereas before it took them a loss of 8 tons of shoes just to make 1 airplane. So ideally, China will make shoes, the United States will make airplanes, and there'll be a higher amount available total than both, and they'll be able to find some terms to trade.
Now China is also better off. They would rather trade 4 tons of shoes for a plane than give up 8 tons of shoes for producing a plane on their own. Now hopefully your head isn't spinning. Being able to do these calculations is good, but it's more important to understand the main idea. Individuals and countries should specialize in producing things in which they have a comparative advantage, and then trade with other countries that specialize in something else. This trade is mutually beneficial. Now that's the production possibilities frontier. In the real world, it's way more complicated than a simplified model, and we're only in the beginning.
So this graph is super simplified, but the idea that countries should focus on producing the products for which they are better suited is huge. Way huge. In reality, the U.S. is the world's leading manufacturer and exporter of airplanes. It produces more than 40% of all planes. At the same time, the U.S. produces less than 2% of the world's shoes, electing instead to import them from countries in Asia. The graphs aren't real, but the concepts are. Another reason you should learn this is because you might hear a politician or someone on the news argue that international trade destroys domestic jobs. And even though it may seem counterintuitive, economists for centuries have argued that trade is mutually beneficial to whoever's trading. Now you know what? Now to be fair, there are all sorts of other intolerable issues associated with international trade, like child labor, dangerous working conditions, and pollution. And we promise to address these in a future video. But if there's one point on which most economists agree, it's that specialization in trade makes the world better off. No country in recent decades has achieved sustained improvements in living standards without open trade with the rest of the world. Countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe.
Okay, this part is kind of is I don't agree with. So I'm not gonna play it. But in general, I would say that the wealth of Europe obviously was built on going to other countries and stealing their resources. The wealth of Europe was built on using slave labor for free. So you can call that trade, you can call that what you will, but it's true that the wealth of many countries is built on the getting wealth from other places. And eventually, yes, we can probably guess. I think it's fair to say, to use modern examples, China, South Korea, Japan, their developmental models were based on exports and trade, and they've all seen great increases in quality of life and economic development. So I'm not going to argue with that. What she was going to say was basically that some countries that don't trade have not seen economic development. So if you take North Korea, of course there's political issues. It's not because they don't want to trade. And the international community has kind of cut them off from economic trade. So in that case, it's not really their choice to do that. And the same is true for the other countries that she mentioned, Venezuela, Iran. They're being cut off by international pressure. So of course they don't benefit from that. The US, of course, has a huge internal market, and the Chinese have developed from an economy that was based on trade and exports to being maybe 1/3 based on trade and increasingly based on internal economic activity. So once a country develops, they still benefit from trade, but there's still a lot of internal activity that's important. Trade within the country. In Vietnam, we had a lot of trade within the country for centuries and centuries. So that's the argument. That's what people say. Comparative advantage is what, even if there's an absolute advantage where you feel that one country can produce anything better than another, there are comparative advantages that mean that countries should specialize in one good, making one good or service over another. And that's the argument. That's the philosophical argument for trade. We also have the evidence of development to show for it. So that leads us to our syllabus. And our topic now is free trade. So, let's see, just so we know the vocabulary. Host country and home government incentives for international trade. So, host country would be the country that we are trading with in this case. And the home government is Australia. Incentives means something they use to encourage you to do something. Incentives. If your parents say if you get straight A's in your report card, you'll get a new motorbike, that would be an incentive. For international trade, including grants and taxation. We'll get into that. And then we have free trade agreements. free trade agreements. Free trade. So trade is trade, right? Trade is something you can do with Pokemon cards. Trade is something you can do in very simple ways. Then we have the term free trade, which is a little bit different from this general idea of trade. Free trade, so as we know, governments have the power to regulate taxation that they see as fit to place on not only income, but business activity and also trade. Taxes on trade are called tariffs, T-A-R-I-F-F-S. You've probably seen that word before. To go back to our globalization arguments, as we know, businesses want to be uncontrolled as much as possible. And so that's what the word deregulation means. And deregulation comes from the term regulation. Regulations are laws and about the conduct of business. So we have it's usually sets of laws. The difference between a law and a regulation usually is a law is what you're allowed to do or prohibited from doing, and a regulation usually determines how you should do it. What is the legal way to do something? Not about stopping you from doing it, but what is the way that the law allows you to do it? And that's about hygiene in a restaurant, right? You're allowed to have a restaurant, it's legal, but you have to follow the regulation on hygiene in the restaurant. So regulations as applied to trade have to do with how countries trade and also taxation. Companies don't like regulation, but regulations have been there for a while because they have a purpose. All regulations were made into law because of probably some businesses were doing something that was not good for the public, right? So we have regulations that are there to help control the worst selfish elements of business. Business has its basis in profit. The shareholders of a company their main goal is supposed to be making a profit. The company promises them that, that's fine. But as I described them before, that makes them into wild animals. So in order to keep them from eating all the things around, we have to regulate them. We have to put some limits or some cages in, how they operate. And free trade agreements are just regulations that are tariffs and trade regulations are just the kind of things that had a purpose. There was a reason to keep that animal in a cage, to keep those businesses in a cage. So let me go through what kinds of regulations typically exist before talking about free trade agreements. The first one is tariffs. A tariff is a tax. Now, we can think of the tax as being related to or not having a purpose, or just being, we can take it for granted. Governments just tax. But actually, there are reasons why a government might want to tax. So, if you're taxing income, the reason why you tax income is because as a government, you need to provide services to society. That's healthcare and education, military protection. So the income tax that's being paid by citizens and workers and people who make money is based on the idea that there are some social goods, there are some community goods that people would not be able to organize or pay for individually. Could you walk down your ham if you lived in a ham and the ham had bad, it was a bad road and needed to be fixed? Could you go down your ham with a hat and say, hey, would you like to put in some money to repair this road? Some people would say, sure. Other people would say, no, I don't care about it. It doesn't bother me the way it is. And they might be hoping that somebody else might fix the road and they don't have to pay. And they would take advantage of the situation. So that's why we have income taxes, because we have to pay for social goods and it has to be fair for everyone. Companies typically have to pay taxes for similar reasons. I guess if you think about a company and the workers that the company has, they want educated workers, right? Most companies want workers who are able to perform tasks and have skills that are necessary to be productive. Where does that come from? Schools. So they should have to contribute to the education of their workers. So that's why we tax companies. A healthy worker is more productive than a worker that's sick all the time. That wasn't always, a concern for business in the Industrial Revolution. Their idea before was, okay, well, just let one worker die or get sick and then replace them with another worker. It's very simple. Once you get more skilled employees, or once workers have more power to fight for their rights, it becomes important for the society to have better health care. So companies pay taxes because they want their workers to be healthy. The US, even though we don't have a social health care for everyone from the government, the employers still provide insurance coverage for the workers. So that's become a tax, basically, on the companies. So then we get to trade. Why does trade require tariffs? Well, companies trade, so the same things that are true for why we have taxes on companies would be true for tariffs as well. We want to put tariffs on companies because they are going to send their goods and services through our airports, into our shipping ports. They're going to use our roads to get their products to our customers. They're going to need our customs services. We're going to spend government money hiring workers to check, inspect, and make sure that the products are safe. So all those things that the government has to provide in terms of infrastructure are the reason why we should put tariffs on trade. There's another reason that is perhaps more important for some countries, in particular developing countries, and that's based on how countries develop, right? There are different ways for countries to develop. One of the ways they develop is to build up their own companies to be strong enough to have competition. So whether or not it's not just about trade itself. When you get to all the products and all the services, we're not just like saying, okay, here's one country that has curry spices, and here's another country that sells cars. And these two countries only have one product, and they can exchange, and they'll both be happy, because now this country has cars, and this country has curry spices. At one point, maybe that was true, but now there are domestic producers and international producers of the same products. So we have cars or motorbikes that are manufactured in India, and then we have cars that are manufactured in England. So India itself doesn't necessarily need someone to make cars for them, but they might want cheaper cars or better quality cars or a different kind of cars. So today's trade is not only about exchanging things that maybe you can't get or were not available, but they're about increasing competition between local and foreign companies. So that puts a whole different spin on it, right? Because now, you can say that, okay, the English car producer is more efficient than the Indian car producer up to a point. And then at that point, well, the Indian producer might say, well, yeah, you've been in business for 75 years and I've been in business for 20 years. Of course we're not as efficient as you. Of course we're not at that level. And if you come here and then, you know, we have free trade and there's no protection of our industries, then when you come here, our industries will die, and then we'll be dependent on your industries. From a strictly economic point of view, you can make the argument that it's better to just let whatever the more efficient company come in and take the market share. Okay, well, that's fine, but we don't just live in strictly economic elements. We have social elements, we have political elements. People have pride in the work that they do. Countries don't want to be dependent on other countries for important elements of their standard of living or quality of life. Countries all, you know, in order to develop, you have to be able to have time to develop industries. So development isn't just about money in your pocket, it's about having local levels of skill and education and industry that match international standards. So the argument for tariffs, and sometimes it's called the infant industries argument, is that you're protecting your babies, you know, infants. You're protecting your baby industries from unfair competition from overseas. There is tremendous pressure from the West and the international community and the trade organizations, World Trade Organization, for countries to eliminate tariffs and to sign free trade agreements. Free trade. Free trade, if you want to define it, means trade with no tariffs or restrictions. So, so that's one thing. So that's one regulation. We have regulation of tariffs. Another kind of regulation is on product safety and quality of products. There are differences between countries' expectations in terms of product safety and product quality. So, on the one hand, that can be very good, because if everyone has a standard that's higher, then that's good for consumers everywhere and safer for everyone. On the other hand, if the regulations are very different, some companies will take advantage of the low regulations in some countries to save money on production costs, and they'll exploit the differences in environmental regulation and product safety and worker safety regulation. So that's another element of free trade, right? Free trade can be, the good part of free trade can be that it can raise the standards, that safety standards, for example, across borders, and create standardization of expectations for workers' safety and treatment. The downside is that free trade with less taxes, with no taxes but no benefits to local workers, just means that some countries can exploit others. Another area of regulation internationally is intellectual property. Intellectual property laws are different in different countries. In particular, I'll give an example of pharmaceutical products. Maybe you notice that sometimes when you buy a medicine, it has the name of the medicine on it, and sometimes when you buy the medicine, it has the name of a brand. In the United States, the intellectual property laws allow brands to have long-term patents on medicines and charge extremely high prices. In countries that don't have, you find medicine without brands and they just talk about the medicine, it's called generic, and that means that you're not selling like the brand. When you go to a pharmacy, when I go in particular, because I'm Nui-Nukwai, they'll always offer me the French medicine and the brand, and I'll say, look, I just need the normal one. It's the same, it's exactly the same, but this one is is much cheaper, and the cheapness comes from the intellectual property cost that you're paying for the French medicine or the American medicine. It's not different, it's not better quality, you're just paying for patents, basically. So there are many countries that want everybody to have the same intellectual property laws. In this case, it would raise prices for consumers to pay American, so everybody would have to buy the American medicine. Free trade agreements are also involved with, well, I think for now that's a good starting point. But that's the basis. So free trade is about regulation, or the reason why we have regulations on trade are to protect local industries, to allow countries to develop. Also about free movement of capital. I should have mentioned this before. Free trade agreements will mean that the ownership of businesses can change and that capital can flow into the market more freely. So that gets into the idea of stock markets and investments. So there are different kinds of investment. You can invest in things that are in the market and they go up and down. So if I put money in the stock market and I have a good tip or an idea that something is going to go up, I can buy it. You know, the idea of stock markets is that you're supposed to believe in the company, invest in it, help support its growth, and then take the benefits from it later, long term. But nowadays, everything happens very quickly. You put money in the morning, the company has money to invest, and then the second that the stock price goes up, because they see that, oh, there's going to be great investment, the newspaper makes a report, everybody buys that stock, you just pull out with your profit and run away. So we don't want to have that kind of free movement of capital or that kind of free trade, in a developing country. We don't want to have capital running in and out. We're trying to develop and make a steady course. So what we want is called foreign direct investment. We want companies and investors to come here and actually make a factory, invest in something that you can touch, that's real, not just some speculation about the movement of some asset. So foreign direct investment. So there's limits. There's limits that we put and regulations that countries put on how other countries can invest. What ownership they can have of companies in that country. Can they own it 100% or do they have to have a local partner? So obviously, so there's a lot of limits, that country, and there's a reason. Again, when I talk about regulation, it's not that, oh, we just want to stop business. I mean, nobody wants to stop growth. Nobody wants to stop business. The reason why we have regulation is because there's a purpose behind it. There's a reason for it. So when the newspaper or business magazines or industry lobbyists or companies talk about free trade and we have to deregulate everything, it's this self-interest that they're talking from. It's not actually in every case going to be better for everyone. So same argument basically as before, right? Regulations have a purpose, and deregulation in some cases is probably possible, and there may be a reason why those laws are not necessary. If a country gets strong enough, like South Korea, they can start to have free trade agreements. You can see at the bottom of page 21, there's a free trade agreement between Korea and Australia. Now, in the cases of those two countries, there are some definite industries that would benefit for both. Australia has some goods that Korea needs, and Korea's manufacturing of electronics would be very good for Australia and keep them from having to produce them. Both countries benefit, and it doesn't hurt the industries in those countries. It just helps them get more customers. That's the ideal free trade agreement, is some kind of situation where both sides can benefit. Okay, so what are some incentives? Talk about incentives for trade. Obviously, the country is going to negotiate free trade agreements. That's what governments do. Why don't here? I'll do this Korean Australian one. It's very short. Wait, is this one? Maybe I have to write it in the same order as this weird. Yeah. Thought I wrote it the exact way as the book had it. Let me try one more time. See if I get it different. Well, these are from Austrade, so let's look at maybe this one. Oh, okay, here we go. 2 minutes.
Australia's economy could be boosted by as much as $650 million a year once a free trade agreement between Australia and South Korea is formalised.
2 months after negotiations concluded, details of the deal were today released. While consumers seeking new electronic goods and cars look set to benefit, the big winner is Australia's beef industry.
Australia has a long economic history with South Korea. In 1989, Bob Hawke sparked the idea for the APEC concept in Seoul.
A more formal vehicle for regional cooperation.
Today, details of a bilateral agreement, all 1,800 pages of them, between the two countries was unveiled.
There's the elimination.
Today,
this word here, bilateral, I want to...
Details of a bilateral...
Okay, this word, bilateral agreement. So they already said that they think that the two biggest beneficiaries of this trade agreement are going to be the beef industry. They love that beef in South Korea. They want that Australian beef, and Australia will be benefiting by being able to sell cars, or South Korea will benefit from selling their cars. Like bicycle. So a unicycle has 1 wheel. A bicycle has 2 wheels, a tricycle has 3 wheels. Uni, bi, tri. Bi means 2. Lateral means together, side by side. So bilateral trade agreement means 2 countries. So Vietnam has many bilateral trade agreements. The alternative to bilateral trade agreements is the ASEAN agreement. Here in Vietnam, we're part of that. That's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and that's called a trading bloc or a free trade area. So we have bilateral, which is 2 countries, and then a trading bloc. So just know that there's a little bit of a difference.
Agreement, all 1,800 pages of them, between the two countries was unveiled.
There's the elimination of 99.8% of tariffs on
99.8% of tariffs, so they're really going for it here, real free trade.
things that we export to Korea.
South Korea is Australia's 3rd largest trading partner, buying $19 billion worth of Australian goods and services each year. Trade is expected to be 23% higher by 2030 as a result of the agreement.
Well, basically, Korea has no energy and not much livestock, so they're very dependent on food security and energy.
Korea will gradually phase out tariffs, but the effect will be immediate for priority products like liquefied natural gas and automotive parts. along with raw sugar, wheat and wine. Duty-free quotas for dairy will be eliminated over 20 years. Beef's 40% tariff will go over 15 years.
But it wasn't until the BSE scare, the mad cow scare, that Australia really got into the market.
In fact, Australia supplies 2/3 of Korea's beef market.
It is also restoring our competitive position with the United States and the EU and the Asian countries who have already struck a couple of years ago agreements with Korea.
Locally, the agreement will mean some of the world's best-known Korean consumer brands will become more affordable.
Korean-made cars like Kia and Hyundai may become cheaper once their 5% import tariff, which was originally designed to protect the Australian car manufacturing industry, is reduced.
Unions, though, are calling the FTA a cows for car deal.
Unfortunately, it's at the expense of Australian manufacturing and Australian manufacturing jobs.
It comes as the Bureau of Statistics said new car sales fell last month by 3.5%. The Korea-Australia Free Trade Agreement is expected to be signed within months and is likely to come into force by the end of this year, giving some a reason to dance. Ricardo Gonzalez, SBS World News.
Giving some people a reason to dance. I guess what that means is that other people don't have a reason to dance. And that's it, you know, there's always going to be someone who wins and someone who loses in these free trade agreements. The argument is that the winners will be more than the losers, but of course having losers means that you have political problems and issues too that need to be dealt with. So let's look at our book for a second. I'm just going to discuss a little bit of, well, at least go over part of it. This chapter is not very useful. It's horrible. The document that I'm going to send, or I'm going to post tonight for you is this one. Is it this one or that one? Uh-oh, I don't see it. Here it is, here. I'm going to put absolute versus comparative advantage, and it's got some good examples in it. And there's another one about, free trade advantages and disadvantages. And this is what I want you to read before the next lesson on Thursday. So it's quite okay. So two main, I'm going to post these two articles for you. Advantages and disadvantages of free trade. And the other one again is absolute versus comparative advantage. So that's useful. And I think one more thing I can show you today is we think about the political, no, I think I should do that. I'll do that next class. The political factors of why, or what you have to consider before you make a free trade agreement. Yeah, we'll do that next time. So I'm just going to go over part of the book. Okay, governments support business growth. So that's the first thing from the syllabus, right? Okay, so how do businesses support? What incentives do they give for business growth and expansion overseas? Why? They do it because it increases or improves the nation's GDP, gross domestic product, GDP is the value of all the goods and services produced in an economy. It's a way of measuring overall wealth and growth. Theoretically, jobs are created and governments are able to collect more taxes, duties, and fees so they can raise the quality of life. They never say that, but they should raise the quality of life in that country. The nation's wealth increases, which should result in an increase in the standard of living. Okay, there you go. The standard of living for all Australians. Why? More money for investments in skills, schools, education, and healthcare. Successive Australian governments have standardized laws and regulations. There's that word standardized to make them international standards, and introduced self-regulation. I don't know what they're talking about there. The goal is to increase profit and efficiency of the private sector by reducing the time and money spent on complying with different laws in the different states and territories that they operate in. A similar process is ongoing on a global scale. Domestically, it means that states have to have the same laws and regulation, and globally, national governments negotiate a standardization of laws and regulations between countries. Okay, so poorly written, unclear. So the governments of Australia, there's different states. We're Western Australia, but and only recently did everybody in Australia take the same kind of ATAR exams. It used to be that every single state had its own university entrance examinations, but they've standardized them now. So now we all take the ATAR exam. This allows universities to make better comparisons with between students of different states. It also gives us kind of an international standard to be able to compare Australian education outcomes to other countries. So that's good, right? So that's something that helps creating a standard, something that everyone can understand the same way.